again, thank you everyone for joining today. My name is Kaylee Gibbons. I'm hosting today's webinar, Thankfully Now. And joining me is Justin Mayhew, Senior Director of Engineering at Weave, and Paige Kerman, Director of Product Design at Weave. We'll introduce ourselves and talk a little bit about why we're here in just a moment. But before we begin, I'm just going to kick us off with a couple housekeeping items. First of all lines are muted to prevent any background noise throughout the presentation. If you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A tab on the right of your screen there. There's a section at the end of the presentation today where we'll go over frequently asked questions, and we'll go through anything that you add there. So please feel free to add questions throughout the presentation today. And then finally, you will receive a recording of this webinar over the next few days, so be on the lookout for that in your email inbox. And with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump in. So today's agenda, just at a high level, like I mentioned, we are going to talk a little bit about bandwidth, introduce ourselves at Bandwidth and Weave, and then we're going to go into the meat of the presentation. And there's sort of two main topic areas we're going to focus on. We're going to talk about how patient preferences are shifting today and what that movement looks like. And then secondly, we're going to talk about how their options are proliferating and what they're doing with that increased choice. So we'll dive into all of that in a moment, talk a little about where we're getting some of this data from. But before we do that, like I mentioned, my name is Kaylee Gibbons. I'm the Solution Marketing Manager here at Bandwidth, covering all of our messaging products. And if you're not familiar with Bandwidth, welcome. We're a global communications platform, and we help product leaders and developers integrate voice and messaging capabilities into their applications, their APIs. We're here today to focus on how these capabilities shape patient communications, and that's why I'm joined by Paige and Justin from Weave. So I'm maybe just going in order on my screen. Paige, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit and what you do at Weave, and then Justin, you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Putting the pressure on with me doing the intro first. Hi, everyone. So nice to be here. I am Paige Kerman. I'm the Director of Product Design at Weave. I have been in kind of the design world for about 14 years now, with a large focus on especially the medical space. So really excited to dive into what we're seeing as far as experience trends and what I've seen throughout my career. Okay, Justin, off to you.
I'm Justin Mayhew, Senior Director of Engineering. Been at Weave for a little over 3 years, but I primarily work with our communications team. That'd be our voice platform and our message offering as well. So also happy to be here.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you both. So what's prompted kind of some of today's conversation, as we mentioned, this is going to be focused around patient health and preferences. But Bandwidth, as hopefully many of you know, we provide communications capabilities across industries. And what we've seen from this position across industries is that there are some trends, and that is simply that consumer and customer experience expectations are on the rise. As we've looked across the market and across segments, a few things kind of come to be true as we look at these statistics on the screen. The first kind of summary point is that most customers bring their expectations from one industry to another. So their experience in the retail space is going to influence their experience in the hospitality space and in the patient engagement space. And then secondly, the vast majority of customers expect immediate engagement through digital channels. So as you can expect, these changes, these kind of rising tides are going to have implications in the way that patients responded to Bandwidth's annual patient engagement survey. So this is our second year running this. We surveyed about 1,500 patients with a relatively wide age range. All of them had seen their healthcare provider within the last year, and we asked them a lot of different questions about their patient experience with their provider and their communications preferences as they've changed over the years. And so I realized I didn't change the slide. So this is the quick overview of just kind of what we've captured and who we spoke with. And the first bullet kind of agenda item that I mentioned is just an overall trend and their preferences changing. And I think that it's a surprise to no one that a major triggering event in this, a major accelerant in this, was COVID-19. 73% of patients identified themselves as knowing and being aware of their own digital engagement and communication preferences changing in light of COVID-19. 73% of them said this. A couple other stats just to kind of support this that we that we took away from the survey. 62% of patients have scheduled telehealth appointments since 2020, so have engaged with a healthcare provider over a digital platform. 65% of patients say they're more comfortable with telehealth now, and about half say their comfort with telehealth has increased over time. And so the idea here is that patients are self-identifying as becoming more comfortable with digital channels as they engage with their healthcare provider. A couple other key statistics. One of the first things that jumps out when we talk about patient communications happening over digital channels is the question of PHI. And so no one on this panel is a legal counsel, so we're not going to dive super deep into PHI today. But I do think that these trends that we're seeing around digital engagement expectations do influence the way that certainly like across the industry, we understand our engagement and expectations that patients have around PHI. So I think these two statistics are very telling in that way. 57% of patients told us that they're comfortable with PHI going over text message, and 66% told us that they are comfortable with PHI going over phone calls. That's over half in both cases. And so what this really is telling us is that patients are putting a premium on ease and accessibility when it comes to engaging with their healthcare provider. They're putting that at a premium over perhaps more marginal privacy concerns, or marginal as they see them. So channels, and this is really relevant because channels like text messaging and voice are not end-to-end encrypted. This shows a trend where patients are willing to accept some of that risk in order to get access to the communications they need more regularly. We'll talk a little bit more about like what this looks like, what those channels are, why patients may be saying this. But I think it leads into some really interesting findings from a little bit closer to the patient. So what Paige and Justin have brought today, talk a little bit through about how this actually plays out in the platform and the preferences that they're seeing come through their providers and patients on Weave's platform. So Paige and Justin, I'll move to the next slide and let either of you just jump in.
Awesome. So one of the things that we saw when evaluating our actual patient base, so these are customers of our customers, is that despite 83% of people wanting immediate attention to requests coming into offices, only 15% of people actually had text messaging enabled. And so part of this could be on the patient side, but part of it could also be on the provider and on the office side, where you might not know that people want text messaging unless you explicitly ask for consent. And these types of things can actually be wrapped into general consent forms. Again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not going to pretend to be, but getting consent from your patients to send things over text message, things like that, even if it's just general appointment scheduling, things along those lines, can actually be done reasonably easily. And I would expect that as we see more and more people do that this number, this 15% of people that are actually getting text messages will end up growing. And then when we look at the number of people that have email reminders enabled, it's actually even smaller. So when I first was talking to Kaylee about all of this, my thought was, oh yeah, probably more people have email reminders enabled than text message reminders because it's a more standard form of communication. But as we've seen in experience trends over the years, people prioritize text messages more. I don't know about all of you, but I'm an inbox zero kind of gal in my text messages, but I am not in my email inbox. I'm someone that will stack up emails for a few days and then reply to all of them at once. So I think we're seeing that trend actually switch a little bit more towards text messaging being the primary form of communication, and then email reminders and email notices actually being a secondary form. I know Justin has worked a lot with our communication teams here at Weave, just in terms of how this is actually shaping things on our roadmap. Justin, do you want to speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I can. Really, as patient confidence grows, one thing that is pressing us to adopt quickly is RCS, which most of you may know is the successor to SMS. It's still not considered, though it's considered secure, it's still not considered a HIPAA compliant channel, though there's little that you can do there's a lot you can do to discourage and little you can do to prevent customers from using it that way.
definitely. A couple other, I think, pull quotes here that y'all surfaced. I'd love to hear more about some of these.
Yeah, Justin, go for it.
Yeah. So despite the increasing popularity in messages, our number one most requested feature has been for some time automated appointment reminders by phone. This customers spend hours attempting to do this, either for patients who didn't confirm their appointments by text message or preferred to not be contacted by text message. It's requiring hours of their day to go into this. So that's an upcoming feature that we've had in store.
And something that's kind of interesting about that, I'm actually just going to pop back to that slide, is that this is a reasonably small office that actually put in this quote that you can see here, where they're saying it takes them an hour and a half a day. And that's not necessarily the exception. That's kind of the rules that we see this taking a large chunk of their time. But this is also a really important thing as we consider communication preferences across generational differences, where people in elder care might have to receive a phone call because there's one shared landline across multiple people, things like that. So the communication preferences definitely vary depending on the segment of patient that you're trying to communicate with.
Yeah, I was going to ask that a similar follow-up question, but Justin, I'll let you. I know there's another slide here, kind of along the same lines.
Yeah, really along the same lines. This points to the kind of generational differences that Paige mentioned, where older patients either don't have a cell phone at all, or that just happens to be the better method for contacting them.
Right.
They're not adopters of text messaging.
Yeah. We spoke about this a little bit in prep for this discussion, but I think there is this interesting, and we'll go into more in some upcoming stats too, but there is a little bit of a gap here that we're seeing between what patients are expressing in our survey that they would like to see more of, and what we see providers may be opting into or providing, or what we see actual patients receiving messages through their providers. And so I'm curious, from both your points of view, what you see as maybe the most prominent reasoning for that kind of gap. Any thoughts? Or
Yeah, my thought is really just that people don't know it's available. I think a lot of times people have gotten so used to this concept of calling a provider, or on the office side, calling a patient, that it's kind of been the norm for 2 decades that's what you do. However, I think that as we are seeing more communication trends change, this is potentially an area that a lot of practices actually have a lot of opportunity for growth. If you can meet the patient where they want to be met, which, as we're seeing, is a lot of times in text messaging or in other immediate forms of communication, as opposed to a call where you have a lot of phone tag, you might actually see that you'll have greater success connecting with patients more immediately, having better success delivering what they're looking for in a quick manner.
Yeah, and I'll add that we also see that some of our customers are aggressive adopters of technology, and others are very traditional, right? So in the same way, adoption can change both from patients and customers.
Yeah, absolutely. I know, I, for one, I have never thought to ask my doctor for text messaging, but I know they have it if they text me and then I use it. So it's kind of, very anecdotal, right? But it's in the same line. So let's talk a little bit about what patients are saying they want and prefer. So just really quickly to top it off, I think this is an overarching metric where 70% of patients told us that they expect notifications and alerts to be personalized from their healthcare provider. And personalized can mean a lot of different things, but in general, we're kind of considering this an umbrella metric, because it means that patients essentially reserve or expect the right to influence how their provider speaks to them, whether that is addressing them by name or simply making sure that they're contacted in the way that is most suitable for them. And again, this underscores a larger point, and that is simply that regardless of the channel that we use, generic communications are no longer enough to engage patients. We need to make sure that we're reaching them, in Paige's words, reaching them where they are, and where they're asking to be contacted. It's increasingly important for providers to validate that they know their patients as well. Again, thinking a little bit back to this idea that patients are taking their customer expectations or customer experience expectations from one industry to another. Patients are customers, and they see the way some of their favorite brands interact with them and see the kind of personalization that's possible. And there is a bit of a discrepancy if they're speaking with their provider, and it's a very sterile, non-personal engagement. And so those expectations are beginning to transfer, as we talked about at the top of the call. I'd love to hear, I know Paige and Justin, y'all have some ways in which you're implementing this in Weave's platform, some ways in which you encourage or enable providers to do some of these things. Love to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So before we dive into this, I want to tell a little story about how I see this not only showing up for patients, but also how it impacts offices. So back when I first started at Weave, one of the things that I did was I took a look at our icon color and I said, this poses a real challenge for people that have any sort of color blindness or maybe sensitive eyes, things like that. And we need to change it. So I made the call to change the color slightly from this kind of aqua bright blue to a little bit deeper of I would say similar to a royal blue. When I did this, our customers blew up our support lines. And when I say blew up, I'm not talking about 20 to 30 calls. I'm talking about a few hundred calls to our support lines. And so then following that, one of the biggest things that people were requesting was, I want to actually be able to personalize my own color. I am sick of having Weave determine what colors I should use for everything. I want my own flexibility. And it was really interesting kind of taking that one experience that we actually see exactly as Kaylee said, like patients are requesting personalization, but we're seeing that also apply to offices. We're seeing more and more people requesting very high levels of personalization. So in these two screenshots here, these are very simple, but two things that we incorporated kind of in response to this is we built out a way for users to actually change the color of their platform. Seems like a simple touch, but this is something that was really important to our customers, especially when it comes to upholding their own brand guidelines, having colors set for everyone in their office, things like that, but also the ability to customize their own dashboard so that they can actually see exactly what they want to see when they want to see it, as opposed to having this one size fits all approach. So again, this doesn't necessarily go too much toward communication, but I did just want to highlight that more and more we're seeing personalization become important to the office and to the patient. So in this next slide here, I wanted to just kind of show how important communication personalization is also in terms of being able to brand things correctly. To many of the offices that we work with, one of the most important things to them is that the communication looks like it's coming from them. They don't want it to be a standard plain text template. They don't want it to be, boring and signed sincerely. They want to use things like warmly or cheers or things like that. So we built out a few things to help that. One was that we built out essentially a brand hub where people could upload their company logo, their company colors, things along those lines that would actually help them personalize that experience even more. But then we're also seeing that kind of on the email communication and text communication side, being able to insert dynamic fields. So you can say things like, hello, Paige, instead of just saying, hi there. And those types of things, as silly as they might seem, they go such a long way in communicating with patients in the way that they want to be communicated with. So then taking this kind of one step further on the patient side, because I just spoke a little bit about the office side. But one of the things that our patients really appreciate that we have built into the platform that they don't even know about is we have the ability to add notes to our communications. So essentially what this means is, let's say I was in the office and I had said to my doctor, oh yeah, I'm taking my kids to California next week to learn how to surf. The doctor could actually make note of that. And so then the next time someone came in to text with that patient, they could say something like, hey, Paige, just checking in, like, how was that surfing trip? Are you able to get in next week? And so those types of personalizations, even though they're very small and very, honestly, they are hyper personal because they do take a little bit of time. They aren't something that you can apply in bulk to every customer, but they go a long way in developing that connection and reducing the level of sterileness that comes with typical doctor to patient or office to patient communications. Justin, I just monologued for a few minutes, so anything that you want to add there?
No, I think that's great. You've covered all the points. Yeah.
Awesome.
So diving back into some of the kind of patients' expressed expectations around these things, if some of what we're talking about feels like too high a watermark for the healthcare space or feels like too big of a leap, if it's a little tempting to shrug off, these numbers are essentially our why numbers. These are the numbers that kind of attempt to explain why providers can't afford to shrug off some of these communication preferences as we head into the future. 44% of patients told us that they will seek a new healthcare provider simply based on their communication preferences. 27% of patients, so over a quarter of patients, told us that they'll switch healthcare providers simply on the basis of whether or not that provider communicates via text messaging. These are really pretty powerful numbers, and I think that it's easy to think that some of these expectations are really like maybe nice to haves and not need to haves. But I think, and I believe either Paige or Justin, you already touched on this. I think the way to look at these things is rather than simply expectations, these are the ways that patients are raising their hands and telling us we want to be engaged with our provider. We want to see our appointment reminders. We don't want to no-show. We want to show up. This is how you can reach us, and this is how you can ensure that we're more engaged. And I like was sharing with Paige and Justin in prep for this, like even just a personal anecdote here. You know, when I first looked at this number, I thought, surely no one cares that much about communication preferences when it comes to their doctors. But then I realized I have before. I know my son, who's very healthy, but he has a lot of different specialist doctor's appointments. And in the end, I ended up having to choose his doctors and his network based on the fact that they were all using the same communication platform, because I simply could not keep up with the amount of communications I was receiving from different doctors. And I needed them to be standardized in a certain way. I needed to know how I could reach out to them. I needed, frankly, to know that I could text and get text updates because I was not going to see them if they reached my inbox. And so really taking a step back and realizing that some of these preferences are truly about patients wanting to engage with their providers more closely. And so I think this kind of leads to our final kind of thesis and point for today is simply that an omnichannel strategy is absolutely imperative to stay competitive in the healthcare space going forward. One size does not fit all. There's not one channel that will meet every patient's need. And so what's important is to make sure that we have all the baseline necessary channels and that we give patients the options to opt in and kind of make their preferences known when it comes to those communications. And so as a part of our survey, we asked patients to tell us a little bit about what channels they like to get what communications from. And we saw some trends develop. So there is no, like I said, one size fits all for any of these communications. There's no channel that was 100% of patients wanted this channel for this communication. There's a spectrum of preference here. But we saw some trends, and I would bucket them largely in kind of three different buckets. The first is care reminders. So more time-sensitive, urgent messages that patients need to respond to quickly in order to make sure that they're getting the care or the prescriptions that they need. So these are things like reminders to set up preventative care appointments, and then reminders that appointments are coming up. So confirmation, just a reminder, this is the address for your appointment. Are you attending? Yes or no? And then refill reminders, the kinds of things that are, again, time sensitive and require immediate responses. Like Paige mentioned, most folks have a 0%, a red inbox 0 for their text messages, and text messages have 98% read receipts. And so it makes sense that that these would be the communications that patients are saying, I have to see this, send it to my text inbox. The second piece is changes and appointment changes, test results, anything, of course, that requires a little bit more context, maybe a little bit more nuance, a little bit more conversation, where you're pulling up your calendar, or a doctor is providing a bit more answering questions live. Obviously, those are going to be communications that patients prefer to have over the phone. And then the final bucket I kind of call more passive communication. So these are things that patients there may be times that there may be an ultimate deadline for some of these things, like intake forms and surveys after an appointment, but they can be managed a little bit more flexibly based on a patient's time. They can flag them in their inbox, get to them when they need to get to them. They're not as time sensitive. So these are kind of the buckets we see here from the survey. Paige and Justin, I'm curious, anything that jumps out to you when you see some of these metrics or some of these preferences and how they relate to Weave?
Justin, if you have anything to share, I'll let you go first since I've been talking a bunch, but I have some thoughts when you're done.
I'll turn it over to you, Paige.
Okay. When I saw these numbers, I actually or not these numbers, but the heart scale, let's say, I was actually tremendously surprised how much emphasis there still was on phones. And the more I thought about it and the more I kind of noodled on why that might be, I think it's still because phones just are the status quo. It is what we're used to. And even though text messages are coming up and email, we're all used to at this point, phones, I don't know about all of you, but I have mine literally sitting right here. Like, we are always attached to our phones. Phones are easy. And so I'm not terribly surprised about that, but I do love that Bandwidth is recommending kind of an omni-channel approach and getting creative with how you actually engage customers, is the best thing you can do. And what I would really recommend, just from a user experience perspective, is every office is going to look a little bit different. For instance, for pediatrics, you're probably never going to see text messaging be very high because it's unlikely that your patients actually have texting. Whereas for a lot of different verticals where you do see patients managing their own communications, you might see texting be a lot higher. So watch your own customer base and see what they're doing, and then try to cater the way that you are actually building your omni-channel presence to support more of where your customers are at or more of where they're requesting, just to make sure that you have the best possible experience for them.
That's awesome. Great. Thank you both. Okay. All right. So I think that this is the last bit on the actual survey overview. Just a couple conclusions that we can draw from all of this. Like we've mentioned here at the end, I think a major takeaway is that a multifaceted omnichannel approach is absolutely paramount to having an effective patient communication strategy. The channel mix of that approach can vary based on the communication and the patient's preference. And so that's why it's so important, third, to ensure that patients have a way to make their preferences known and have some choice in how those communications are being sent out. So these are major takeaways here. I'm going to kind of dive in next. We have, like I mentioned, kind of a Q&A section where we're going to kick it off with a couple frequently asked questions. If you have any questions you want to add to these, please feel free, like we said at the top, add them into that Q&A tab on the right. We'll be happy to answer them live as best we can. And what we can't answer, we'll be happy to follow up with afterwards. So I'll start us off here. And so Justin, Paige, I have, like we mentioned, I have some questions here that we get a lot. I've got some answers prepared. If either of you want to weigh in on either of these, please feel free to just jump in and talk over me at any point. The first one is, it goes back to that PHI topic. So one of the first questions that we'll get when we have some of these discussions is, can we send PHI over SMS and voice? And like Justin mentioned, because they aren't end-to-end encrypted, these channels raise a lot of flags and a lot of questions around what providers can do with them over those channels. And so some covered entities, so meaning HIPAA entities that are required to follow HIPAA guidelines when it comes to and manage protective health information. Some covered entities choose to use messaging, for example, to direct patients to a secure portal. So rather than putting the actual information in the text message, they'll link to a secure portal where the customer can simply, or the patient can simply click, and it opens up where there may be more, sends them to the application or portal that they can sign in and see that information. For some providers, patient choice and consent is a path that they use to create a means to send those updates and actually share some level of information over SMS. More platforms are embracing transparency and kind of the optionality we talked about today with their patients to create compliant and accessible communication channels under messaging regulations that are subject to HIPAA. And I think a key thing here is to remember protected health information is a huge umbrella. There's a lot of really small, even just appointment details that could fall under PHI. And so these are the kinds of communications that I think some providers lean towards providing patients the choice to opt in to receive that information over those channels, which, as we mentioned in today's presentations, more and more patients are becoming likely to do.
Kaylee, do you mind if I jump in there really quick?
Please, yeah.
So something that I've seen happen more and more just in talking to users, things like that, is actually people using multiple forms of communication to deliver the PHI. And what I mean by that is it's really easy to text a patient and say, hey, I have some confidential things to go over. When is a good time to call you? So that way you're engaging with them and kind of scheduling something via text and, again, meeting the patient where they are. But then you bring it back to a phone call for that actual delivery of PHI. And I love that approach. Again, it keeps things simple for the patient, also puts the power in their hands to say, like, yeah, I am working 9 to 5. Can you call me after hours? Or, hey, it's okay to call me and leave a voicemail. I love that approach just because it simplifies things for everyone.
That's really interesting. That's a great point, Paige. I hadn't even considered that use case. That's really cool. And I'll caveat everything we just said, like I did at the top, but just to be clear, none of this qualifies as legal counsel. The best advice you can get is by your own legal counsel to make sure they're advising you correctly in terms of your HIPAA obligations. Okay, another question that we get a lot is simply, we talked a lot about simply different use cases that you might prefer one channel for over another. And so sometimes that can be a little bit overwhelming to look at how many options there are, how many communications you can send to a patient, and how many channels are out there. Even the channels that we listed on our kind of omnichannel overview, that kind of spectrum we saw, those are just 3. We know there are others like secure login portals like we're talking about here. And so those choices can become overwhelming. And so if you were to ask, kind of what use cases make the biggest impact, where you might want to focus some of your digital engagement strategy, I think that a major place, particularly where text messaging can make a big impact in the digital communication strategy for patients, is around appointment reminders. There are a lot of different studies out there that kind of show how text messaging, one text reminder, can improve no-show rates across the board. There are several different studies that we reference in our patient preferences report. But I think when we think about how we're using communications to improve patients' lives, what we really want to do is make sure that patients are coming to see their providers and they're taking part, they're participating in their care and follow-up plans. And so I think reminders and notifications that encourage patients to show up are a great place to start when it comes to figuring out what their preferences are and how they're most likely to respond, because we really see a very low lift in responding to those patient preferences can make a huge impact when it comes to patient no-shows, which is what we're looking to do. All right. So anything, Paige or Justin, anything to add there or any thoughts?
No, the only thing that I would add is in those appointment reminders, one of the things that I see offices sometimes do that is really great is including links to reschedule on their own, things like that. Of course, most people have online booking on their websites or,
Right.
otherwhere easily accessible. But again, the more information you can deliver to the patient in the way that they want to be delivered, it's great.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Cool. Well, Justin, Paige, thank you so much for joining us today and just sharing so many insights from what you're seeing through Weave's platform and the providers that you work with. Really, really appreciate your time today. Thank you, everyone, for jumping on. All of our audience members, so appreciate it. As we've posted in the chat, you'll see a recording to this and other resources that are available within chat if you want to follow any of those links. And we'll send them to you in follow-up in a couple of days as well. Thank you, everyone, so much, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for us.